The dust cloud on the horizon appeared just after dawn, moving slowly across the barren landscape of the Texas Panhandle, like a dark omen against the crimson sky. Jacob Winchester stood on the porch of his weathered ranch house, squinting through the morning haze at what would prove to be the most extraordinary encounter of his 35 years of solitary existence. What he witnessed that September morning in 1887 would shatter everything he thought he knew about his family's tragic past and set in motion events that would transform not only his own destiny, but the lives of two young women whose survival had depended on secrets that could destroy or redeem everything Jacob held sacred. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jacob Winchester had spent the last 15 years of his life as a ghost haunting his own existence. The W Ranch stretched across 12,000 acres of prime grazing land in the Texas Panhandle, but its vastness only served to amplify the emptiness that had consumed him since that terrible day in 1872 when his younger brother, Thomas, had vanished without a trace during a Comanche raid. The ranch house itself stood as a monument to unfulfilled dreams and abandoned hopes. Built by their father, Samuel Winchester, in the prosperous days before the Indian Wars, it had been designed to accommodate a large family and generations of Winchester descendants. The grand stone structure boasted 12 rooms, wraparound porches, and architectural details that reflected the ambitions of a man who had envisioned building a cattle empire that would span multiple generations. But now the house felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Most of the rooms remained closed and unused, their furniture covered in white sheets like ghostly reminders of the life Jacob had expected to build with his brother by his side. He occupied only the kitchen, his bedroom, and the study where he kept the ranch's financial records, moving through the empty spaces like a man serving a life sentence in a prison of his own making. The W had indeed prospered under Jacob's management, despite his emotional detachment from its daily operations. His cattle bore the finest bloodlines in Texas, his pastures were well maintained, and his financial accounts showed steady profits that he rarely bothered to spend. Success had come easily to him, almost mockingly so, as if fate were determined to give him everything except the one thing that would have made any of it meaningful. Jacob's foreman, Robert Hayes, had worked the ranch for over a decade and understood better than anyone the peculiar mixture of competence and despair that characterized his employer's approach to life. Hayes managed the day-to-day operations with minimal supervision, while Jacob spent his time in activities that seemed designed more to pass time than to accomplish anything meaningful. "Mr. Winchester's got everything a man could want," Hayes often told his wife during their evening conversations. "Best ranch in 3 counties, more money than he knows what to do with, respect from every cattleman in Texas, but he walks around like a man who's lost his soul and can't figure out how to get it back." The transformation had begun immediately after Thomas's disappearance. The brothers had been inseparable since childhood, with Jacob serving as the responsible older sibling and Thomas bringing the joy and spontaneity that balanced Jacob's serious nature. Thomas had possessed an infectious laugh, a natural way with horses, and dreams of expanding the ranch operations into new territories. His absence had left Jacob feeling as though half of his identity had been torn away. Comanche raid that took Thomas had occurred during one of the final major conflicts between the indigenous tribes and the expanding settlements of Anglo ranchers. Jacob and Thomas had been moving a herd to summer pasture when the war party struck without warning. Jacob had watched helplessly as his brother's horse went down under a shower of arrows, seen Thomas fighting desperately with his rifle before disappearing into a cloud of dust and chaos. When the attack ended, Jacob had found Thomas's horse dead, his rifle broken, and his hat trampled into the mud. But there had been no body, no clear evidence of what had happened to the young man who had been the center of Jacob's world. The uncertainty had been perhaps worse than confirmed death would have been, leaving Jacob suspended between hope and despair, unable to grieve properly or move forward with his life. The years following Thomas's disappearance had been marked by Jacob's obsessive attempts to discover his brother's fate. He had hired trackers, consulted with army officers, interviewed former captives, and followed every rumor or lead that might provide information about what had happened that day. The search had consumed thousands of dollars and countless hours, but had yielded nothing more substantial than conflicting stories and false hopes. Some witnesses claimed to have seen a young man matching Thomas's description, living among various Comanche bands. Others insisted that all the Anglo captives from that particular raid had been killed during the battle. A few opportunistic individuals had attempted to sell Jacob false information or outright fabrications, exploiting his desperation for their own financial gain. The emotional toll of these fruitless searches had gradually eroded Jacob's connections to the world around him. He had withdrawn from social activities, avoided contact with neighboring ranchers, and declined invitations to community gatherings that might have provided opportunities for companionship or romantic relationships. His life had contracted to the essential functions of ranch management and the endless, futile hope that someday he would learn what had happened to Thomas. The morning that would change everything began like countless others, with Jacob rising before dawn to check on his cattle and survey the vast expanse of land that represented both his greatest achievement and his most painful reminder of loss. The September air carried the first hints of autumn, and the grass was beginning to show the golden color that preceded the harsh Texas winter. Jacob had been examining a section of fence that needed repair when he noticed the dust cloud approaching from the northeast. At first, he assumed it was a normal sight, perhaps a neighbor moving cattle or a supply wagon heading toward one of the distant settlements. But as the cloud drew closer, Jacob realized that something was different about this particular group of travelers. The party consisted of approximately a dozen men on horseback, but their movement patterns and formation suggested something more complex than a simple cattle drive or supply expedition. They moved with the disciplined precision of a military unit, yet their clothing and equipment didn't match any army regiment Jacob recognized. As they drew nearer, he could see that several members of the group were leading pack horses loaded with what appeared to be trade goods. Jacob's first instinct was caution. Strangers approaching remote ranches could represent anything from legitimate business opportunities to serious threats. The isolation that he had chosen for emotional reasons also made him vulnerable to the kind of lawless individuals who preyed on solitary settlers. He retreated to the ranch house and retrieved his rifle, positioning himself on the front porch, where he could observe the approaching party while maintaining a defensive position. As the riders came within clear viewing distance, Jacob could see that they were led by a man in his 50s whose bearing suggested military experience. The leader wore a mixture of civilian and military clothing that marked him as someone operating outside normal institutional boundaries. Behind him rode a diverse group that included what appeared to be former soldiers, experienced frontiersmen, and at least two individuals whose features suggested Native American heritage, but it was the rear of the formation that captured Jacob's attention and sent a shock of recognition through his system. Two young women, clearly of mixed heritage, rode side by side on horses that seemed too fine for captives, but too modest for honored guests. Even at a distance, Jacob could see that these women possessed the kind of striking beauty that would attract attention in any setting, but their posture and expressions suggested wariness rather than comfort with their current circumstances. The leader of the party raised his hand in a peaceful gesture as they approached the ranch house, signaling his intentions to communicate rather than threaten. Jacob remained on the porch with his rifle visible, but not directly threatening, following the unwritten protocols that govern such encounters in frontier territory. "Good morning," the leader called out as he brought his horse to a stop about 20 feet from the porch. I'm Captain Marcus Thornton, formerly of the Texas Rangers. We're traveling through this territory on business and wondered if we might water our horses and perhaps conduct some trade." Jacob studied Thornton's face carefully, noting the weathered features and steady gaze that suggested extensive experience in dangerous situations. The man's manner was polite but authoritative, indicating someone accustomed to command but wise, enough to respect the customs of hospitality that govern frontier interactions. "Jacob Winchester," Jacob replied, lowering his rifle slightly. "This is the Double W Ranch. You're welcome to water your horses at the creek behind the house. What kind of trade did you have in mind?" Thornton's expression shifted subtly, as though Jacob's name had triggered some recognition or memory. The captain glanced back at his companions before returning his attention to Jacob, and in that moment, Jacob sensed that this encounter was not as random as it appeared. "We've recently concluded negotiations with several Comanche bands regarding the release of captives and the return of stolen property," Thornton explained carefully. "Among the individuals we've recovered are these two young women, sisters who have been living with the tribes for several years. We're seeking appropriate placement for them as they transition back to settled society." The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. For 15 years, he had dreamed of exactly this scenario, the arrival of someone who might have information about Thomas's fate or even news of his survival. But now that the moment had actually arrived, Jacob found himself struggling to process the implications of what Thornton was suggesting. "Captives?" Jacob asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long have they been with the Comanche? Do they remember anything about other captives, other people who might have been taken around the same time?" Thornton's expression grew more serious, and Jacob realized that the captain understood exactly why these questions mattered so deeply. "These particular young women have been with the Comanche for approximately 15 years. They were taken as children and have spent their formative years living as adopted members of the tribe. Their knowledge of tribal customs and individual members is extensive." The pause before the word extensive seemed to carry weight that Jacob couldn't quite interpret. Thornton was clearly being careful about how much information he revealed, but his tone suggested that these women possessed knowledge that went far beyond casual observation of tribal life. Jacob's heart began racing as he contemplated the possibility that these women might have information about Thomas. If they had been with the Comanche for 15 years, they would have been present during the period when his brother disappeared. They might have witnessed the raid, known other captives, or even encountered Thomas himself during their time with the tribe. "I'd like to speak with them," Jacob said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the emotional turbulence he was experiencing. "If they've been with the Comanche that long, they might have information about someone I've been searching for." Thornton nodded slowly, as though he had been expecting this request. "I thought you might say that, Mr. Winchester. Your brother Thomas disappeared during a Comanche raid in 1872, didn't he?" The confirmation that Thornton already knew about Thomas sent another shock through Jacob's system. This encounter was definitely not random. Someone had directed this party to his ranch specifically, and they came armed with knowledge about his family's tragedy. "How do you know about Thomas?" Jacob asked, his grip tightening on his rifle despite his growing realization that these people represented opportunity rather than threat. "Word travels in certain circles, Mr. Winchester. A man of your prominence searching for a lost brother for 15 years tends to attract attention from people in my line of work. We make it our business to know about unresolved cases involving missing persons and tribal captives." Thornton's explanation made sense, but it also raised new questions about the captain's true motivations and the nature of his business. Jacob was beginning to understand that this encounter had been orchestrated rather than accidental, but he couldn't yet determine whether that was cause for hope or concern. "The young women we've recovered are named Sarah and Maria Delacroix," Thornton continued. Their family was killed during a raid when they were very young, and they've spent their entire conscious lives as members of the Comanche community. They speak fluent Comanche, understand tribal customs intimately, and have knowledge of events and individuals that spans more than a decade of tribal history. Jacob studied the two women more carefully, noting details that his initial shock had prevented him from observing. Both appeared to be in their early 20s, with the kind of natural grace that suggested comfort in outdoor environments. Their clothing was a mixture of Anglo and Native American styles, practical rather than decorative, designed for travel rather than display. The older of the two sisters met his gaze directly, her dark eyes carrying an intelligence and wariness that suggested someone who had learned to evaluate situations quickly and thoroughly. Her younger sister appeared more fragile, staying close to her sibling as though seeking protection from the unfamiliar circumstances in which they found themselves. They're looking for stable placement in a household that can provide them with security while they adapt to Anglo society, Thornton explained. In exchange for appropriate compensation, they would be willing to share their knowledge of tribal affairs with someone who has legitimate reasons for seeking such information. The offer was clear, though delivered with the kind of diplomatic language that allowed both parties to maintain dignity while discussing what was essentially a business transaction. Jacob was being given the opportunity to provide these women with shelter and support in exchange for access to information that might finally resolve the mystery of Thomas's disappearance. But Jacob also sensed undercurrents in the situation that suggested greater complexity than Thornton was revealing. The captain's careful word choices, the sisters' obvious wariness, and the presence of what appeared to be a well-armed escort suggested that this placement involved more than simple humanitarian assistance. "What kind of compensation are we discussing?" Jacob asked, though money was the least of his concerns at this moment. $10 per woman would cover our expenses and provide appropriate compensation for the negotiations required to secure their release, Thornton replied smoothly. $20 total for both sisters, plus your commitment to providing them with appropriate housing and the opportunity to learn the skills necessary for integration into settled society. $20 was an insignificant amount for someone of Jacob's wealth, but he understood that the real cost of this arrangement would be measured in emotional risk rather than financial expenditure. If these women possessed information about Thomas, learning the truth might finally provide the closure he had sought for 15 years. But it might also confirm his worst fears and force him to accept realities he had spent decades trying to avoid. Jacob looked again at the two sisters, noting how they seemed to communicate with each other through subtle glances and gestures that suggested a bond forged through shared hardship and mutual dependence. Whatever they had experienced during their time with the Comanche had created a partnership that transcended normal sibling relationships. "I'll need to speak with them directly before making any commitments," Jacob said finally. "If they're going to be living on my ranch, I want to understand their expectations and make sure this arrangement serves everyone's interests." Thornton smiled for the first time since his arrival, and Jacob realized that he had passed some kind of test that the captain had been conducting throughout their conversation. "I think that's a very reasonable approach, Mr. Winchester. Why don't we move this conversation to a more comfortable setting? We've been traveling for several days, and the ladies would appreciate an opportunity to rest while we discuss the details of this arrangement." As Thornton's party dismounted and began tending to their horses, Jacob found himself facing the possibility that his 15-year search for answers was about to reach a conclusion. But he also sensed that whatever these women knew about Thomas would come with complications that would challenge his understanding of family, loyalty, and the moral complexities of survival in a world where the boundaries between civilization and wilderness remained dangerously fluid. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The interior of Jacob Winchester's ranch house felt uncomfortably formal as he led his unexpected guests into the main parlor. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't entertained visitors in over 3 years. Captain Thornton's men remained outside, tending to their horses and maintaining a respectful distance from what was clearly intended to be a private negotiation. Sarah and Maria Delacruz entered the room with the cautious movements of wild creatures, suddenly confined in an artificial environment. Jacob noticed how their eyes continuously tracked potential exits, how they positioned themselves near the doorway, and how the younger sister Maria never strayed more than arm's length from Sarah's protective presence. "Please, sit wherever you're comfortable," Jacob offered, gesturing toward the collection of furniture that had once hosted his parents' social gatherings. The elaborate sofa and matching chairs now seemed almost absurdly formal for this unprecedented situation. Sarah remained standing, her dark eyes scanning the room's details with the methodical attention of someone trained to gather intelligence from her surroundings. She noted the family portraits on the walls, the expensive but dusty furnishings, and the overall atmosphere of a home that had been maintained but not truly lived in for many years. "You have lost someone important to you," Sarah said suddenly, her English carrying only the slightest accent that suggested years of speaking multiple languages. "This house remembers happiness, but it has been empty of joy for a long time." The observation startled Jacob with its accuracy and insight. He had expected these women to be traumatized victims, requiring gentle treatment and patient communication. Instead, Sarah demonstrated an emotional perceptiveness that suggested she was far more capable of understanding complex social dynamics than he had anticipated. "My brother Thomas disappeared 15 years ago," Jacob replied carefully. "I've been searching for information about what happened to him ever since." Maria spoke for the first time, her voice softer than her sister's, but carrying the same underlying strength. "The Comanche remember many things. Stories are passed from person to person, from season to season. What was lost is not always forgotten." Captain Thornton had been observing this interaction with the satisfied expression of someone watching a carefully planned scenario unfold according to expectations. He stepped forward slightly, apparently deciding that the preliminary courtesies had been adequately observed. "Mr. Winchester, perhaps it would be helpful if I explained the circumstances under which these young ladies came to be in our custody," Thornton suggested. "The situation is somewhat more complex than a simple rescue operation." Jacob turned his attention to Thornton while keeping the sisters in his peripheral vision. Something in the captain's tone suggested that the complexity he referenced might have significant implications for any arrangement they reached. "These women weren't captives in the traditional sense," Thornton continued. "They were adopted into the tribe as children and have lived as full members of the Comanche community for their entire conscious lives. Their release was negotiated, rather than forced, and it required considerable diplomacy to convince the tribal leaders that the women would be better served by returning to Anglo society." The revelation changed Jacob's understanding of the situation fundamentally. These weren't traumatized victims desperate for rescue, but individuals who had been convinced to abandon the only life they had ever known. Their wariness wasn't just about adjusting to unfamiliar surroundings. It was about being separated from everything that had given their lives meaning and structure. "Why did you agree to leave?" Jacob asked, directing the question to both sisters, but focusing primarily on Sarah, who seemed to be the spokesperson for the pair. Sarah exchanged a rapid series of glances with Maria before responding, and Jacob realized they were communicating through a system of subtle signals that had been developed over years of shared experience. Whatever decision-making process they used, it operated at a level of intimacy and understanding that excluded outsiders. "Completely, the world is changing," Sarah said finally. "The old ways of living are becoming impossible. The buffalo herds are gone. The soldiers come with greater numbers each season. The reservation boundaries grow smaller. We understand that surviving in this new world requires different knowledge and different skills. Maria added quietly, but we also carry responsibilities to preserve what can be preserved. Stories, knowledge, understanding of how people lived before everything changed. This knowledge has value for those who know how to use it wisely. Jacob was beginning to understand that these women weren't simply seeking refuge or assistance. They possessed specific knowledge and had made a calculated decision to leverage that knowledge for their own survival while potentially helping others resolve unfinished business from the past. "Tell me about Thomas Winchester," Jacob said directly, abandoning any pretense of casual conversation. "If you've been with the Comanche for 15 years, you would have been there when he disappeared. Do you know what happened to him?" The silence that followed his question seemed to fill the room with tension. Sarah and Maria looked at each other again, conducting another of their wordless conversations, while Captain Thornton watched the proceedings with a detached interest of someone observing the chess game between skilled players. "We know of Thomas Winchester," Sarah said eventually, "but this knowledge is not simple to share. It involves understanding many things about how people survive when their world is destroyed, about choices that cannot be undone, and about the difference between the truth that people want to hear and the truth that actually happened." Jacob felt his heart racing as he realized that these women did indeed possess information about Thomas's fate. But Sarah's careful words also suggested that whatever they knew might be more complicated than the simple answers he had been seeking. "For 15 years, I need to know," Jacob said firmly. "Whatever happened to him, whatever choices he made, I need to understand the truth. I've spent half my life wondering whether he's alive or dead, whether he's suffering somewhere or has found peace. The uncertainty has been worse than any definitive answer could be." Maria spoke up unexpectedly, her voice carrying a gentleness that seemed intended to soften the impact of difficult information. "Before we share what we know, you must understand that learning the truth will change how you remember your brother and how you understand your own life. Some knowledge cannot be forgotten once it is received." The warning sent a chill through Jacob's system, but it also confirmed his growing certainty that these women held the keys to resolving the mystery that had defined his adult existence. Whatever they knew about Thomas, it was significant enough to warrant serious consideration before revelation. Captain Thornton cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we should formalize the arrangement first, and then proceed with the exchange of information in a more structured manner. Mr. Winchester, are you prepared to offer these women shelter and support in exchange for their knowledge and assistance?" Jacob realized that he was being asked to make a commitment before fully understanding what he was purchasing. The $20 was insignificant, but agreeing to house these women would involve much more substantial obligations. They would become his responsibility indefinitely, requiring housing, food, clothing, and protection while they adapted to a completely different way of life. "What exactly would be required of me?" Jacob asked. "And what would you expect in return?" Sarah answered with the directness of someone accustomed to negotiating survival arrangements. "We need a safe place to live while we learn how to function in Anglo society. We can work, we understand horses, cattle, farming, hunting, food preparation, and many other practical skills. We are not seeking charity, but partnership. In exchange," Maria continued, "we can share our knowledge of Comanche history, customs, and specific events that occurred during our time with the tribe. This includes information about captives, raids, tribal movements, and individual stories that may be of interest to people seeking answers about missing family members." The offer was remarkably straightforward, but Jacob sensed underlying complexities that weren't being explicitly addressed. These women had lived for 15 years in a society with very different values and social structures than Anglo-ranching communities. Integrating them into his household would require patience, understanding, and probably significant adjustments to his own lifestyle. There's something else you should consider, Thornton added. These women's knowledge extends beyond simple tribal history. They understand political relationships between different Comanche bands. They know about trade networks and resource management. And they have information about territorial disputes that could be valuable to government officials, military leaders, and other interested parties. Jacob realized that Thornton was suggesting these women might be valuable to people other than himself, and that their knowledge could potentially be leveraged for purposes beyond satisfying personal curiosity about missing relatives. The implication was both intriguing and concerning, as it suggested that providing shelter for Sarah and Maria might involve him in broader political and economic complexities. Are there others who might want access to this information? Jacob asked directly. Possibly, Thornton admitted. But any such arrangements would be entirely at the discretion of the women themselves and their host. They're free individuals making their own choices about how to use their knowledge and with whom to share it. Sarah stepped forward slightly, asserting her authority over the negotiation. We choose to share our knowledge with Jacob Winchester because we believe he will use it responsibly and because we understand his need to learn the truth about his brother. But we also want to establish clear boundaries about our expectations and obligations. What kind of boundaries? Jacob asked. We are not servants or property, Maria stated firmly. We are partners in an arrangement that benefits everyone involved. We will work to earn our place in your household, but we will not be treated as inferior or exotic curiosities. We require respect for our knowledge, our customs, and our right to make our own decisions about our future. The statement impressed Jacob with its clarity and strength. These women had obviously thought carefully about the challenges they would face in Anglo society and had developed strategies for protecting their dignity and autonomy, despite their vulnerable circumstances. I can agree to those terms, Jacob said. But I also need to understand what kind of information you're offering regarding my brother. Is he alive? Did something happen to him that I should know about? Sarah and Maria exchanged another of their silent communications before Sarah responded. Thomas Winchester's story is long and complex. It cannot be told properly in a few minutes of conversation. But we can tell you that he survived the raid in which he was captured, and that his life afterward involved choices and experiences that shaped him into someone very different from the young man who disappeared from your ranch. The revelation that Thomas had survived sent a shock of joy and hope through Jacob's system, immediately followed by anxiety about the implications of Sarah's careful phrasing. If Thomas had survived and been changed by his experiences, why hadn't he returned home? What had prevented him from contacting his family for 15 years? Is he still alive now? Jacob asked, his voice tight with emotion. The story we have to tell includes events that occurred over many years, Maria replied diplomatically. Some parts of it will bring you happiness, and some parts will be difficult to accept. But you will finally understand what happened to your brother and why he made the choices that he made. Captain Thornton stepped forward to conclude the negotiations. Mr. Winchester, do we have an agreement? $20 for the women's placement, plus your commitment to providing appropriate housing and support while they adapt to settled society. Jacob looked at Sarah and Maria, noting the dignity with which they waited for his decision and the quiet strength that suggested they would survive and thrive regardless of his choice. But he also understood that this moment represented his last real opportunity to learn the truth about Thomas's fate. We have an agreement, Jacob said firmly. But I want to hear Thomas's story tonight, after we've had time to get settled and comfortable with each other. Sarah nodded solemnly. Tonight, you will learn what happened to Thomas Winchester. But remember what we told you about knowledge. That cannot be forgotten. After tonight, your understanding of your brother and your own life will be changed forever. As Jacob reached for his wallet to pay Captain Thornton, he realized that he was about to purchase much more than information. about his missing brother. He was buying entry into a world of moral complexity and emotional challenge that would test everything he thought he knew about family, loyalty, and the price of survival in a hostile world. The evening shadow stretched long across the Texas plains as Captain Thornton's party prepared to depart, their business concluded and their payment secured. Jacob watched from his porch as the men mounted their horses with the efficient movements of a group accustomed to traveling light and moving quickly. Whatever mission had brought them to the W Ranch was only one stop in a larger journey that would take them deeper into the frontier territories. "These women will serve you well, Mr. Winchester," Thornton said as he settled into his saddle. "But remember that their knowledge comes with responsibilities. Use what they tell you wisely, and understand that some secrets have been kept for good reasons." With that cryptic warning, the captain touched the brim of his hat and led his men eastward, leaving Jacob alone with Sarah and Maria de la Cruz for the first time since their extraordinary negotiation had concluded. The sudden silence that followed the departure felt heavy with unspoken expectations and the weight of revelations that could no longer be postponed. Jacob turned to face the two women who now stood on his porch like visitors from another world. In the golden light of the setting sun, their mixed heritage was more apparent, revealing features that spoke of complex family histories and cultural intersections that transcended simple racial categories. They carried themselves with the unconscious grace of people who had learned to move silently through dangerous terrain, but their eyes held the sharp intelligence of individuals who had survived by understanding human nature in all its complications. "We should prepare dinner," Sarah said practically, breaking the silence that had settled over the group. "Food makes difficult conversations easier, and we have much to discuss before this night is finished." Jacob nodded, grateful for the suggestion of normal domestic activity to ease the transition into what promised to be an emotionally challenging evening. He led them into the kitchen, a large space that had been designed to accommodate the cooking needs of a substantial household, but had been simplified over the years to serve his solitary existence. Maria examined the well-equipped kitchen with obvious appreciation, running her fingers over the heavy iron stove and studying the arrangement of cupboards and work surfaces. "This is a good space for cooking," she observed. "We can prepare meals that will satisfy both Anglo and Comanche tastes if you are willing to try new foods." "I'm willing to try anything," Jacob replied, though he wondered what exotic dishes these women might create with the simple ingredients available in his pantry. His own cooking had been reduced to basic fare that required minimal preparation and created minimal cleanup. Sarah had begun examining the contents of his food storage, areas with the systematic efficiency of someone experienced in making the most of limited resources. She noted the quality of his preserved meats, the variety of canned goods, and the well-stocked root cellar that reflected his ranch's prosperity. "You live well for a man alone," she commented, "but you eat like someone who finds no pleasure in food. Tonight we will cook together, and you will remember what it means to share a meal with family." The word family sent an unexpected pang through Jacob's chest. For 15 years, he had lived without any meaningful human connections, maintaining only the professional relationships necessary for ranch operations. The prospect of sharing his evening meal with companions who understood something about loss and survival created both anticipation and anxiety. As the women began preparing dinner with ingredients they selected from his stores, Jacob found himself observing their collaboration with fascination. They moved together with the synchronized efficiency of people who had cooked countless meals under difficult circumstances, communicating through subtle gestures and shared understanding that required no verbal coordination. Sarah seasoned strips of beef with a combination of familiar spices and mysterious additions that she produced from a small leather pouch, while Maria prepared vegetables with knife skills that spoke of years spent processing game and wild plants for survival meals. Their techniques combined Anglo cooking methods with tribal knowledge, creating fusion dishes that promised flavors unlike anything Jacob had experienced. "Tell me about your lives before today," Jacob said as he helped with simple preparation. Tasks: how did you survive 15 years with the Comanche, and what convinced you to leave? Maria answered while continuing to work with her hands, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting ordinary events rather than extraordinary survival stories. "We were very young when our family was killed. Sarah was 7, and I was 5. We were adopted by a woman named Running Deer, who had lost her own children to diseases brought by white settlers. She raised us as her own daughters," Sarah continued. "We learned to speak Comanche, to understand the customs and traditions, to contribute to the band's survival through our work and knowledge. We were not prisoners or outsiders. We were members of the community with all the responsibilities and privileges that came with belonging." Jacob tried to imagine these women as young children adapting to such radically different circumstances, learning to function in a society that most Anglo settlers viewed as savage and threatening. Their obvious competence and emotional stability suggested that their adoption had been genuinely nurturing rather than merely protective. "But something changed," Jacob observed. "Something made you decide that leaving was necessary." Sarah's expression grew somber as she tended to the cooking meat. "Running Deer died 2 winters ago. She was the connection that bound us to the community, and without her protection, our position became more complicated. Some tribal members began to view us as symbols of the changes that were destroying traditional ways of life. The pressure from the army and the reservation system was also becoming unbearable," Maria added. "Each season brought new restrictions, new demands, new evidence that the old ways of living were being systematically eliminated. We understood that adapting to Anglo society might be our only chance for long-term survival." Jacob sensed that their explanation, while truthful, was incomplete. These women had made strategic decisions based on careful analysis of their options, but they were also protecting information that they weren't ready to share with someone. They had known for less than a day. The meal they produced exceeded all of Jacob's expectations. The beef had been transformed into something rich and complex, with flavors that combined familiar comfort with exotic sophistication. The vegetables had been prepared with techniques that enhanced their natural qualities, while adding subtle enhancements that made each bite interesting. As they ate together at the kitchen table, Jacob felt a warmth and companionship that he had forgotten was possible. The simple act of sharing well-prepared food with attentive companions reminded him of family dinners from his childhood, before loss and isolation had contracted his world to the essential functions of survival. "This is excellent," Jacob said sincerely. "I hadn't realized how much I missed eating meals that were prepared with care and attention." "Food is one of the ways people show love and respect for each other," Sarah replied. "When you cook for someone, you are giving them part of your life and knowledge. It creates connections that go beyond simple nutrition." As they finished eating and began clearing the table, Jacob felt both anticipation and dread about the conversation that could no longer be postponed. The evening light was fading, and the time had come to learn the truth about Thomas's fate. "Are you ready to hear about your brother?" Maria asked gently, as though she understood the magnitude of what this moment represented for Jacob. Jacob nodded, though he wondered if anyone could ever be truly ready to learn information that would fundamentally change their understanding of their own life and family history. Sarah gestured toward the main parlor. "This conversation requires comfort and privacy. We will tell you Thomas's story completely, but you must promise not to interrupt with questions until we have finished. The story has a structure that must be preserved for you to understand its full meaning." They settled in the parlor with the soft glow of oil lamps creating an intimate atmosphere that seemed appropriate for sharing secrets that had been preserved for 15 years. Sarah and Maria positioned themselves so that they could see each other clearly, maintaining their ability to communicate through their subtle signal system. Thomas Winchester was 18 years old when he was captured during the raid on your cattle drive. Sarah began, her voice taking on the rhythmic quality of someone trained in oral storytelling traditions. He fought bravely before his horse, was killed, and he continued fighting on foot until a war club struck him unconscious. The warriors who captured him intended to kill him, but an older woman named Grey Wolf Woman intervened. Jacob felt his breath catch as he finally heard the specific details of Thomas's capture. For 15 years he had imagined countless scenarios, but hearing the actual events described with eyewitness precision created a mixture of relief and renewed anguish. Grey Wolf Woman had lost her son in a battle with soldiers the previous spring, Maria continued. She saw something in Thomas that reminded her of her dead child. Perhaps his courage, perhaps his defiance, perhaps simply his youth and strength. She claimed him as a replacement for the son she had lost. Thomas was badly injured and remained unconscious for several days, Sarah resumed. When he awakened, he found himself bound and guarded, but also being cared for by Grey Wolf Woman and her family. She had decided that he would live, but that he would live as her adopted son rather than as a captive or slave. Jacob struggled to process this information. Thomas had survived the raid, but had been immediately placed in circumstances that would have tested every aspect of his character and resilience. The brother Jacob remembered had been strong-willed and independent, qualities that might have made adaptation to captivity extremely difficult. The first months were very challenging for Thomas, Maria continued. He repeatedly attempted to escape, despite his injuries and despite the impossibility of surviving alone in unfamiliar territory. Each failed escape attempt resulted in punishment, but also in demonstrations of the community's determination to integrate him into tribal life. Grey Wolf Woman was patient but firm, Sarah added. She understood that Thomas's resistance came from his attachment to his previous life and his loyalty to his family. But she also understood that survival required him to develop new loyalties and new ways of understanding his place in the world. Jacob realized that they were describing a process of psychological transformation that would have challenged everything Thomas believed about himself and his identity. The young man who had been captured would have been forced to choose between maintaining his original sense of self and adapting to circumstances that required fundamental changes in his values and allegiances. What happened to him? Jacob asked, unable to wait for the story to unfold at its natural pace. Did he adapt? Did he accept his new life? Sarah smiled sadly. Thomas Winchester proved to be more adaptable than anyone expected. Within 2 years, he had learned to speak fluent Comanche, had developed skills as a warrior and hunter, and had begun to understand the complex social and political relationships that govern tribal life. By his 3rd year of captivity, he was no longer truly a captive at all. He became Grey Wolf Woman's son in every meaningful sense, Maria continued. He participated in raids, contributed to the band's survival through his hunting and fighting skills, and eventually married a young woman named Swift River. He built a life that was rich and purposeful, though completely different from anything he had imagined during his youth on the ranch. The revelation that Thomas had not only survived, but had thrived in his new circumstances sent a complex mixture of emotions through Jacob's system. Relief that his brother had found happiness was coupled with bewilderment about why Thomas had never attempted to contact his family or return to his original life. Did he ever try to come home? Jacob asked quietly. Did he ever think about his family or wonder whether we were still searching for him? Sarah and Maria exchanged one of their meaningful glances before Sarah responded. Thomas thought about his former life often, especially during his first years with the tribe. But as time passed and his new life became more fulfilling, he began to understand that returning to Anglo society would be impossible for someone who had become genuinely Comanche in his thinking and values. There were also practical considerations, Maria added. Thomas had participated in raids against Anglo settlements. He had killed white men in battle. Returning to his former life would have meant facing potential prosecution for actions that were considered honorable within Comanche society, but criminal under Anglo law. Jacob felt the ground shifting beneath his understanding of Thomas's situation. His brother hadn't simply been prevented from returning home by external circumstances. He had made conscious choices that prioritized his new life over his original family connections. But there's more to the story, Sarah said softly. More that you need to understand about Thomas's life and about why we were chosen to bring you this information. Jacob braced himself for additional revelations, understanding that whatever he had learned so far was only the beginning of a much more complex truth about his brother's fate and his own family's history. The lamplight flickered across Sarah's face as she prepared to continue Thomas's story, her expression carrying the weight of knowledge that had shaped her understanding of family, loyalty, and survival for more than a decade. Jacob sat motionless in his chair, struggling to process the revelation that his brother had not only adapted to Comanche life but had embraced it so completely that returning home had become impossible. Thomas Winchester lived as Iron Wolf for 8 years, Sarah continued, using what Jacob now understood was his brother's Comanche name. He became one of the band's most respected warriors, known for his strategic thinking and his ability to understand both Anglo and Comanche perspectives. During conflicts, his unique background made him valuable for planning raids and negotiating with other tribal groups. Maria leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying a gentleness that seemed intended to cushion the impact of increasingly difficult revelations. Iron Wolf was also a loving husband and father. Swift River bore him 2 children, a son named Running Eagle and a daughter called Morning Star. He was devoted to his family and took great pride in teaching his children the skills they would need to survive in a changing world. The knowledge that Thomas had children, that Jacob was an uncle to niece and nephew he had never known existed, sent another shock through his already overwhelmed emotional system. For 15 years he had mourned Thomas as lost forever, never imagining that his brother had been building a completely different family just a few hundred miles from the W Ranch. Where are they now? Jacob asked urgently. His wife and children, are they still alive? Are they among the people on the reservations? Sarah's expression grew somber, and Jacob immediately sensed that this part of Thomas's story would be more painful than what he had already learned. The final years of Iron Wolf's life were marked by the increasing pressure that the U.S. government was placing on all Comanche bands. The buffalo herds were being systematically eliminated, traditional hunting grounds were being occupied by settlers, and the army was conducting more aggressive campaigns to force tribal groups onto designated reservations. Iron Wolf understood better than most tribal members what these changes meant for their long-term survival, Maria continued. His knowledge of Anglo society and military tactics allowed him to see that armed resistance could only delay the inevitable, not prevent it. He began advocating for negotiated settlements that might preserve some aspects of traditional life within the reservation system. Jacob realized that Thomas had found himself in an impossible position, caught between 2 worlds and fully accepted by neither. His Anglo background would have made him suspect among Comanche hardliners who wanted to continue fighting, while his tribal adoption and warrior status would have made him a target for Anglo authorities who viewed all Comanche men as enemies. Many warriors disagreed with Iron Wolf's position, Sarah said carefully. They believed that accepting reservation life meant abandoning everything that made them Comanche. A faction led by a war chief named Black Thunder argued for continued resistance, regardless of the ultimate cost. The disagreement created divisions within the band that grew more serious as the pressure from the army intensified. Maria added, Iron Wolf found himself increasingly isolated from former allies who viewed his pragmatic approach as betrayal of traditional values and warrior obligations. Jacob sensed that the story was approaching its climax, and that whatever had happened to Thomas in his final years would explain not only his fate, but also why Sarah and Maria possessed such detailed knowledge of his life and circumstances. In the winter of 1884, 3 years ago, the Army launched a major campaign designed to force all remaining free Comanche bands onto the reservation at Fort Sill. Sarah continued. Iron Wolf understood that this would be the final military action. That continued resistance would result in the complete destruction of his adopted people. He made a decision that required enormous courage, but also created consequences that would haunt everyone who loved him. Maria said softly. Iron Wolf decided to approach the Army commanders directly and negotiate surrender terms that might protect the women, children, and elderly members of his band. The revelation that Thomas had attempted to negotiate with the Army sent a chill through Jacob's understanding of his brother's final actions. Such a move would have required not only courage, but also a willingness to risk being viewed as a traitor by the very people he was trying to protect. What happened when he approached the Army? Jacob asked, though he feared the answer would confirm his growing suspicions about how this story would end. Sarah's voice grew heavy with emotion as she continued. The Army commanders were initially suspicious of Iron Wolf's offer, believing it might be a trap or a delaying tactic. But Captain Marcus Thornton, who was serving as a liaison officer for Indian Affairs, recognized the opportunity to end the campaign without further bloodshed. Jacob started at the mention of Thornton's name, suddenly understanding that the captain's involvement in bringing Sarah and Maria to his ranch was far from coincidental. Thornton had personal knowledge of Thomas's story and had been involved in the events that determined his brother's ultimate fate. Captain Thornton conducted secret negotiations with Iron Wolf over several weeks, Maria continued. They developed a plan that would allow the band to surrender peacefully while preserving some dignity and avoiding the kind of brutal forced march that had characterized other military campaigns. But Black Thunder discovered the negotiations before they could be completed, Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of tragedy. He accused Iron Wolf of betraying his adopted people and demanded that the band council judge him according to traditional law for crimes against the community. Jacob felt his stomach tighten as he realized that Thomas's attempts to save his adopted family had instead placed him in mortal danger from the very people he was trying to protect. The courage that had motivated his diplomatic efforts had been interpreted as treachery by those who couldn't accept the reality of their impossible military situation. The tribal council was divided, Maria explained. Some members supported Iron Wolf's efforts to find a peaceful solution, while others agreed with Black Thunder that negotiating with the Army represented unforgivable betrayal. The debate continued for 3 days, with Iron Wolf defending his actions and arguing that continued resistance would only result in the complete destruction of everyone he loved. On the final night of the council deliberations, Black Thunder and his supporters took matters into their own hands, Sarah said. Quietly, they attacked Iron Wolf's lodge while he was sleeping, intending to execute him as a traitor before the council could reach a formal decision. Jacob's breath caught as he realized that Thomas's story was approaching its tragic conclusion. The brother who had survived capture, adapted to a completely different culture, and built a new life with a loving family, had ultimately been destroyed by the impossible contradictions of his position between two worlds. Iron Wolf fought bravely, but he was outnumbered and taken by surprise, Maria continued. Swift River was killed trying to defend her husband, and both children were mortally wounded in the attack. The lodge was burned, and Black Thunder declared that the family of the traitor had been eliminated according to traditional justice. The devastating revelation that Thomas, his wife, and both children had been murdered by their own people sent Jacob into a state of shocked silence. For 15 years, he had imagined countless scenarios for his brother's fate, but he had never considered that Thomas might have died as a victim of the very community that had adopted and nurtured him. But Iron Wolf survived, Sarah said suddenly, her words cutting through Jacob's grief and confusion. He was severely burned and left for dead, but he managed to crawl away from the burning lodge before losing consciousness. We found him the next morning, barely alive but still breathing. The revelation that Thomas had survived the attack sent another shock through Jacob's overwhelmed emotional system. If his brother had lived through the massacre of his family, what had happened to him afterward? Where was he now, and why hadn't he tried to return to his original family after losing everything that had kept him with the Comanche? We were just children then, but we had learned enough about healing from the tribal medicine women to know how to treat severe burns and wounds, Maria explained. We hid Iron Wolf in a cave near the river and cared for him in secret while the Yule band prepared for their final resistance against the army. For weeks we thought he would die, Sarah added. His injuries were terrible, and he seemed to have lost the will to live after witnessing the murder of his wife and children. But slowly, very slowly, he began to recover physically, even though his spirit remained broken by what he had endured. Jacob found himself leaning forward in his chair, desperate to learn what had happened to Thomas after his recovery, and why the story seemed to be leading toward revelations that would be even more shocking than what he had already learned. When Iron Wolf was strong enough to travel, he made a decision that surprised us, Maria continued. Instead of trying to rejoin the band or seeking revenge against Black Thunder, he decided to leave Comanche territory entirely. He said that he no longer belonged to any world, not Anglo society, not Comanche society, not the changing world that was destroying both. Where did he go? Jacob asked urgently. Did he try to come home? Did he think about contacting his family? Sarah and Maria exchanged another of their meaningful glances, and Jacob realized that they were approaching the most significant revelation of the entire story. Whatever they were about to tell him would explain not only Thomas's ultimate fate, but also why they had been chosen to bring this information to his attention. Iron Wolf told us that he could never return to his original family because he had become someone his brother would not recognize or accept, Sarah said carefully. He had killed white men in battle, had lived as a Comanche warrior, and had participated in actions that would be considered criminal under Anglo law. But more importantly, he had changed so fundamentally that bridging the gap between his two identities seemed impossible. He also carried guilt about the deaths of Swift River and his children, Maria added. He believed that his attempts to negotiate with the army had led directly to their murders, and that this blood debt could never be forgiven or forgotten. Jacob struggled to understand how Thomas could have believed that his family would reject him, regardless of what he had done or become during his years of captivity. The bond between the Winchester brothers had been strong enough to survive 15 years of separation. Surely it could have survived the knowledge of Thomas's transformation and experiences. But there's something else, Sarah said softly. Something that Iron Wolf made us promise to tell you if we ever had the opportunity to contact his family. Jacob braced himself for whatever final revelation these women had been saving for the conclusion of their extraordinary story. Iron Wolf didn't disappear into the wilderness to die alone, Maria said. He had a specific destination in mind and a purpose that gave him reason to continue living despite everything he had lost. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Jacob's face as she prepared to deliver information that would change his understanding of everything he thought he knew about his brother's fate and his own future. Thomas Winchester is still alive, Jacob, and he's been closer to you than you ever imagined possible. The silence that followed Sarah's revelation stretched through the parlor like a living thing, heavy with implications that Jacob's mind struggled to process. Thomas was alive. Not only alive, but close enough that his presence had somehow influenced Jacob's daily existence without his knowledge. The brother he had mourned for 15 years had been within reach, watching, perhaps even protecting him. From a distance, where is he? Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible in the lamp-lit room. How close? How long has he been nearby? Maria rose from her chair and moved to the window that faced west toward the rolling hills that bordered the W Ranch. She pulled back the heavy curtain and gestured toward the distant landscape that Jacob knew as well as his own reflection. Do you remember the old hermit who lives in the cave system near Devil's Canyon? She asked quietly. The man your ranch hands call Ghost Walker, because he appears and disappears without warning, trades occasionally for supplies, but never allows anyone to see his face clearly. Jacob felt the world tilt around him as understanding crashed through his consciousness like a physical blow. For 8 years, his ranch hands had reported occasional encounters with a mysterious figure who lived somewhere in the rugged canyon country west of the ranch. The man had never caused trouble, never stolen anything, never threatened anyone. But he had become part of local folklore, a shadowy presence who seemed to know the movement of every person and animal across thousands of acres of territory. That's impossible, Jacob said, though even as he spoke the words, he was remembering dozens of small incidents that suddenly took on new significance. Cattle found safe after being trapped in dangerous terrain. Predators driven away from vulnerable herds, supplies that disappeared from remote line shacks but were always replaced with equal or better items. Signs of someone monitoring the ranch's activities with the knowledge and skill of an experienced cattleman. Ghost Walker has been watching over the W Ranch since 1885, Sarah confirmed. He knows every head of cattle you own, every horse in your remuda, every fence line and water source on your property. He's prevented accidents, warned off rustlers, and guided lost animals back to safety more times than you could imagine. Jacob's mind raced through memories of conversations with his foreman about the mysterious hermit. Robert Hayes had always spoken of Ghost Walker with a mixture of respect and curiosity, describing him as someone who clearly possessed extensive knowledge of ranching operations, but chose to remain isolated from human contact. Hayes has seen him, Jacob said suddenly. Bob mentioned that Ghost Walker sometimes leaves messages carved into trees or arranged with stones, warning about weather changes or potential problems with the herds. Iron Wolf learned to communicate without direct contact during his final years with the Comanche, Maria explained. He developed ways of sharing information that couldn't be traced back to him, methods of helping people while maintaining the distance he believed was necessary for everyone's safety. Jacob stood abruptly and began pacing the room, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of his gregarious, social brother with that of a hermit who had spent 8 years living in complete isolation. The Thomas he remembered had thrived on human companionship and had never been comfortable with solitude. Why didn't he contact me directly? Jacob asked, his voice carrying a mixture of hurt and bewilderment. Even if he believed I wouldn't accept him, why didn't he at least let me know he was alive? Do you understand what 15 years of uncertainty did to me? Sarah's expression carried deep compassion as she responded to his anguish. Iron Wolf believed that revealing his survival would create more problems than it would solve. He had participated in raids against Anglo settlements, had killed white men in combat, and had lived as a Comanche warrior during some of the most violent conflicts of the Indian Wars. In his mind, contacting you would have made you an accessory to his crimes and potentially put you in legal jeopardy. More importantly, Maria added gently, he was carrying enormous guilt about the deaths of Swift River and his children. He blamed himself for their murders and believed that anyone who associated with him would be in danger. His isolation wasn't just about protecting himself. It was about protecting everyone he had ever cared about. Jacob tried to imagine the psychological burden his brother had been carrying for 3 years, living alone with the knowledge that his attempts to save his adopted family had instead led to their destruction. The Thomas he remembered had always taken responsibility seriously, sometimes to the point of accepting blame for circumstances beyond his control. But he's been watching me, Jacob said. beginning to understand the full implications of what Sarah and Maria were revealing. He's been close enough to help with the ranch operations, which means he's been close enough to see how his disappearance affected my life. Iron Wolf understands that his absence caused you great pain, Sarah confirmed. But he also feared that his return would cause even greater pain when you learned what he had become and what he had done during his years with the Comanche. Jacob moved to the window and stared out at the dark landscape, knowing that somewhere in those hills, his brother was living a life of solitude and self-imposed exile. The knowledge that Thomas was alive filled him with joy, but it was joy tempered by the realization that 15 years of separation had created barriers that might be impossible to overcome. "How do you know so much about his current situation?" Jacob asked suddenly. "If he's been living as a hermit for 3 years, how do you have such detailed knowledge of his activities and thoughts?" Maria and Sarah exchanged one of their meaningful glances before Sarah responded. "We didn't lose contact with Iron Wolf when he left Comanche territory. For the past 3 years, we've served as his connection to the outside world, bringing him information about political developments, military actions, and the fate of other tribal members. We've also been his eyes and ears regarding your welfare," Maria added. "He asked us to monitor your situation discreetly to ensure that you were safe and that the ranch was prospering. Everything we've told Captain Thornton about your circumstances came from Iron Wolf's detailed observations of your daily life." The revelation that his brother had been monitoring his welfare through intermediaries added another layer of complexity to Jacob's emotional response. Thomas had cared enough to track his well-being, but had maintained the distance he believed was necessary for both their safety. Thornton knew about Thomas from the beginning, Jacob realized. This entire arrangement was orchestrated to bring me information about my brother's survival. Captain Thornton has been working with Iron Wolf since the final negotiations with the Army, Sarah confirmed. He understands that Iron Wolf possesses valuable knowledge about tribal affairs and territorial politics, but he also respects Iron Wolf's need for anonymity and protection from potential legal consequences. Jacob began to understand that his brother had become part of a complex network of relationships that operated outside normal legal and social boundaries. Thomas's unique background and knowledge made him valuable to people like Thornton, while his legal vulnerability made discretion essential for his survival. "The arrangement that brought us to your ranch serves multiple purposes," Maria explained. "We genuinely needed placement in a safe household where we could adapt to Anglo society. You needed information about your brother's fate. And Iron Wolf needed a way to test whether direct contact with you might be possible without creating danger for everyone involved." Jacob realized that his response to learning about Thomas's survival would determine whether the brothers could be reunited, or whether Thomas would continue his life of isolation. The knowledge that his reaction was being evaluated added pressure to an already emotionally overwhelming situation. "What does Thomas want from me?" Jacob asked directly. "Does he want to see me, or is he content to maintain his current distance?" Sarah's expression grew thoughtful as she considered how to answer his question honestly while respecting the complexity of Thomas's emotional state. Iron Wolf is torn between his desire to reconnect with his original family and his fear that such contact would create problems for everyone involved. He wants to see you, but he also wants to protect you from the legal and social complications that association with him might create. He's also afraid that you won't be able to accept what he's become, Maria added softly. The Thomas Winchester who disappeared 15 years ago was a young rancher with conventional values and a straightforward understanding of right and wrong. Iron Wolf is someone who has killed men in battle, lived according to completely different moral codes, and made choices that can't be easily explained or justified to someone who hasn't shared his experiences. Jacob felt a surge of frustration at his brother's assumptions about his capacity for understanding and acceptance. 15 years of wondering about Thomas's fate had prepared him to accept almost any truth about his brother's survival and experiences. "He's wrong about that," Jacob said firmly. "I don't care what he's done or how he's changed. He's my brother, and nothing that happened during his time with the Comanche could change that fundamental fact." "We hoped you would say that," Sarah replied with the first genuine smile Jacob had seen from her since their arrival. "But Iron Wolf needs to hear those words directly from you, and he needs to be convinced that you understand the risks and complications that association with him might create." Jacob stood at the window, staring out at the darkness that concealed his brother's hiding place somewhere in the distant hills. The knowledge that Thomas was alive and close by filled him with an urgency that made waiting seem impossible. "Can you arrange a meeting?" Jacob asked. "Tonight, tomorrow, as soon as possible. I've waited 15 years to learn the truth about his fate. Now that I know he's alive, I don't want to wait another day to see him." Maria shook her head gently. "Iron Wolf won't agree to a meeting until he's convinced that you truly understand what association with him might cost you. He's not just concerned about legal problems. He's worried about your reputation, your social standing, and your business relationships. He's also concerned about our safety," Sarah added. "If authorities discover that you're harboring someone who participated in raids against Anglo settlements, all of us could face serious legal consequences." Jacob realized that Thomas's caution was based on legitimate concerns rather than simple paranoia. The political climate regarding Indian affairs remained volatile, and association with former Comanche warriors could indeed create legal and social problems that might extend beyond personal consequences. "What would convince him that I'm willing to accept those risks?" Jacob asked. "He needs to see evidence that you understand who he's become and that you're prepared to accept him, regardless of what others might think," Maria replied. "Words alone won't be sufficient. He needs demonstrations of your commitment that prove you've thought carefully about the implications of reunion." Sarah leaned forward in her chair, her expression indicating that she was about to share information that would be crucial for Jacob's understanding of how to proceed. "There's something else you need to know about Iron Wolf's current situation," she said quietly. "Something that makes the question of reunion even more complicated than you might imagine." Jacob braced himself for another revelation, understanding that every answer these women provided seemed to lead to additional questions and complications. "Iron Wolf isn't living alone in those caves," Maria said softly. "He's been caring for someone else, someone whose welfare depends on his continued secrecy and protection." The revelation that Thomas wasn't living alone in the wilderness hit Jacob like a physical blow, shattering his already fragmented understanding of his brother's situation. The image of Thomas as a solitary hermit, consumed by guilt and self-imposed isolation, suddenly gave way to something far more complex and mysterious. Who is he caring for? Jacob asked urgently, his mind racing through possibilities that ranged from fellow survivors of the massacre to injured travelers who had sought refuge in the remote canyon country. Sarah and Maria exchanged their characteristic glance of silent communication before Sarah spoke, her voice carrying the weight of a secret that had clearly been difficult to preserve. "When Iron Wolf's family was murdered, we told you that both children died in the attack," Sarah began carefully. "That was what everyone in the band believed, including Black Thunder and his followers. But the truth was more complicated." Jacob felt his heart hammering as he realized that another fundamental aspect of Thomas's story was about to be revealed or corrected. The emotional roller coaster of this evening had already pushed him beyond his normal capacity for processing shocking information, but the mention of Thomas's children created a new surge of desperate hope. Morning Star, Iron Wolf's daughter, was only 4 years old when the attack occurred, Maria continued. She was sleeping in the back of the lodge when Black Thunder's warriors struck, and the chaos of the fight allowed her to escape through a tear in the lodge wall that Swift River created during her final moments. We found Morning Star hiding in the brush near the river the morning after we discovered Iron Wolf's body, Sarah added. She was traumatized, barely conscious, and suffering from smoke inhalation and minor burns, but she was alive. Jacob struggled to comprehend the implications of what they were telling him. Thomas's daughter had survived the massacre that killed her mother and brother, but her survival had been kept secret from everyone, including the tribal community that had witnessed her family's destruction. Why didn't you tell the band that she had survived? Jacob asked. Surely some tribal members would have wanted to care for her, especially if they disagreed with Black Thunder's actions. Black Thunder had declared that the entire family of the traitor must be eliminated, Maria explained. If he had discovered that Morning Star survived, he would have killed her to complete what he viewed as necessary justice. The only way to protect her was to let everyone believe she had died with her mother and brother. Sarah's expression grew tender as she continued the story. We hid Morning Star with Iron Wolf while he recovered from his injuries. She was the reason he found the will to live when his physical healing seemed impossible. Caring for his daughter gave him purpose when everything else had been destroyed. Jacob realized that Thomas's decision to leave Comanche territory hadn't been motivated solely by his own need for isolation and protection. He had been carrying the responsibility of protecting his surviving child, a responsibility that required complete secrecy and careful planning for long-term survival. When Iron Wolf was strong enough to travel, he made the decision to take Morning Star away from Comanche territory entirely, Maria continued. He understood that as long as they remained anywhere near the tribal communities, there would be risk that someone might recognize her and report her survival to Black Thunder. But he also faced the challenge of caring for a traumatized 4-year-old child while living as a fugitive in wilderness territory, Sarah added. Morning Star had witnessed her mother's murder and her home's destruction. She barely spoke for months after the attack, and she was terrified of any contact with strangers. Jacob tried to imagine his brother attempting to heal both his own psychological wounds and those of a deeply traumatized child while simultaneously creating a life that would keep them both safe from pursuit and discovery. The complexity of Thomas's situation was far greater than anything Jacob had imagined during his years of wondering about his brother's fate. How did they survive those first years? Jacob asked. A severely injured man and a traumatized child living alone in the wilderness. The challenges must have been enormous. Iron Wolf's knowledge of both Anglo and Comanche survival techniques served them well, Sarah replied. He knew how to find water, hunt game, create shelter, and avoid detection by hostile forces. But more importantly, he understood how to help Morning Star heal from her traumatic experiences. He told her stories about her mother's courage and her brother's bravery, Maria continued. He taught her Comanche traditions and songs so that she wouldn't lose connection to her cultural heritage. But he also began teaching her English and Anglo customs, understanding that her future survival might depend on her ability to function in either world. Jacob was beginning to understand that Thomas had spent the past 3 years not just hiding from his own past, but preparing his daughter for a future that remained uncertain and potentially dangerous. The hermit existence that others viewed as simple reclusiveness was actually a complex balancing act between protection, education, and emotional healing. Morning Star is 7 years old now, Sarah said. She's intelligent, curious, and remarkably resilient considering what she's endured. But she's also completely dependent on Iron Wolf for her safety and well-being. This is why Iron Wolf has been so reluctant to consider reunion with his original family, Maria explained. Any change in his current situation could potentially expose Morning Star to danger, either from authorities who might view her as the child of a hostile warrior, or from surviving tribal members who might report her existence to people who still consider her family to be traitors. Jacob felt the full weight of his brother's impossible situation settling over him like a suffocating blanket. Thomas wasn't just protecting himself through his isolation. He was protecting a child whose very existence represented a threat to both their safety. Any reunion between the brothers would have to account for Morningstar's welfare and security. "Does she know about me?" Jacob asked quietly. "Does she understand that she has family beyond her father?" Iron Wolf has told her stories about his brother Jacob and about the ranch where he grew up, Sarah replied. "She knows that you exist and that you've been searching for her father for many years. But she also understands that contact with you could be dangerous for everyone involved." Jacob realized that his 7-year-old niece had been living with the knowledge of his existence while he had no idea that she was alive. The thought of this child growing up in hiding, cut off from the extended family that could provide her with security and stability, filled him with a mixture of heartbreak and determination. "I want to meet her," Jacob said firmly. "I want to meet both of them. I don't care about the risks or complications. They're my family, and they shouldn't have to live in hiding when I have the resources to protect them." Iron Wolf anticipated that you would feel this way, Maria said gently. "But he also knows that your good intentions might not be enough to protect Morningstar from the political and legal realities that surround her situation." Sarah leaned forward, her expression indicating that she was about to share information that would be crucial for Jacob's understanding of how to proceed. "There are people in territorial government and military circles who are still actively pursuing former Comanche warriors who participated in raids against Anglo settlements. Iron Wolf's activities during the Indian Wars make him a legitimate target for prosecution, and Morningstar could be viewed as evidence of his tribal connections. More importantly," Maria added, "there are also tribal members who have accepted reservation life but who still harbor resentments about the conflicts that led to their confinement. If word spread that Iron Wolf and Morningstar had survived and were living under Anglo protection, it could create problems for other tribal families who are trying to build peaceful relationships with territorial authorities." Jacob was beginning to understand that his brother's situation was embedded in a web of political and social complexities that extended far beyond personal family relationships. Thomas wasn't just protecting himself and his daughter, he was protecting an entire network of people whose safety depended on maintaining certain secrets and avoiding certain revelations. "What would it take to arrange a safe meeting?" Jacob asked. "There must be some way for us to see each other without creating danger for Morningstar or problems for other people." "Iron Wolf has been considering that question for months," Sarah replied. "He's developed a plan that might allow for limited contact, but it would require your complete commitment to maintaining secrecy and following very specific protocols designed to protect everyone involved." Jacob felt a surge of hope at the suggestion that Thomas had been actively planning for potential reunion rather than simply avoiding it. If his brother had developed a strategy for safe contact, it meant that he genuinely wanted to reconnect despite his concerns about the risks and complications. "What kind of protocols?" Jacob asked eagerly. "First, you would need to demonstrate that you can be trusted with sensitive information by helping us establish our own security here on your ranch," Maria explained. "Sarah and I are technically still fugitives from reservation authorities, who might view our departure as violation of government agreements with the tribal communities. Second, you would need to prove that you understand the legal and social risks involved in associating with former Comanche warriors," Sarah continued. "This isn't just about your willingness to accept personal consequences, it's about your ability to make decisions that protect everyone involved." Jacob realized that Thomas was essentially asking him to prove his commitment and judgment before risking the safety of his daughter. The test made sense from a protective perspective, but it also meant that reunion would require patience and careful planning rather than the immediate meeting that Jacob desperately wanted. "What specific steps would demonstrate that I understand these risks?" Jacob asked. "Iron Wolf wants to observe how you handle our presence on your ranch," Maria replied. If you can successfully integrate us into your household while maintaining the secrecy necessary for our protection, it will prove that you possess the discretion and judgment required for more complex arrangements. He also wants to see evidence that you're prepared to make personal sacrifices for family welfare, Sarah added. Protecting Morning Star might require you to change aspects of your lifestyle, limit your social contacts, and potentially compromise some of your business relationships. Jacob understood that his brother was asking him to demonstrate the same kind of commitment to family protection that Thomas had been maintaining for 3 years. The test was both reasonable and necessary, but it also meant accepting that reunion would be a gradual process rather than a single dramatic event. How long would this evaluation period last? Jacob asked. That depends on how quickly you adapt to the requirements of maintaining security while building trust, Sarah replied. Iron Wolf has been watching you for 8 years, so he already knows a great deal about your character and capabilities. But caring for Morning Star has made him extraordinarily cautious about any changes that might affect her safety. Jacob stood and walked to the window again, staring out at the dark landscape that concealed his brother and niece somewhere in the distant hills. The knowledge that Thomas was alive had filled him with joy, but the knowledge that Morning Star existed and needed protection had created new urgency around the reunion process. When can we begin? Jacob asked, turning back to face Sarah and Maria. What's the first step in proving that I can be trusted with their safety? Sarah smiled with what appeared to be genuine approval of his determination. The first step has already begun. You've successfully negotiated our placement in your household, and now you need to demonstrate that you can maintain our security while helping us adapt to life on a Texas ranch. But there's something else you need to understand, Maria added, her expression growing serious again. Iron Wolf isn't the only person who will be evaluating your performance during this test period. Morning Star herself will be watching and deciding whether she feels safe enough to meet the uncle she's heard about in her father's stories. The revelation that his 7-year-old niece would be participating in the decision about reunion added another layer of emotional complexity to an already challenging situation. Jacob realized that earning Thomas's trust was only part of the process. He also needed to prove himself worthy of a traumatized child's confidence and affection. The first week of Sarah and Maria's residence at the Double Rubber Ranch tested every assumption Jacob had made about integrating the sisters into his household and daily operations. What he had anticipated as a straightforward arrangement of providing shelter in exchange for information revealed itself as a complex process of cultural adaptation, security management, and gradual trust building that challenged his understanding of both his own capabilities and the sisters' remarkable skills. The immediate practical challenges began with the simple question of sleeping arrangements. Jacob's sprawling ranch house offered multiple bedrooms, but Sarah and Maria seemed uncomfortable with the idea of separating into individual rooms. Their years of shared survival had created bonds that transcended normal sibling relationships, and they had developed sleeping patterns that prioritized mutual protection over personal privacy. We prefer to stay together, Sarah explained when Jacob showed them to separate guest rooms. Our safety has always depended on our ability to communicate instantly if danger arose. Sleeping apart makes us both feel vulnerable. Jacob converted the largest guest room into a shared space, moving in an additional bed and arranging the furniture to provide both comfort and the clear sight lines that the sisters seemed to require. Watching them examine the room's security features, testing window latches, identifying potential escape routes, and positioning their few belongings for quick retrieval, gave him a sobering glimpse into the mindset of people who had lived with constant awareness of potential threats. The sisters' approach to daily ranch operations revealed skills and knowledge that went far beyond what Jacob had expected from their tribal background. Sarah demonstrated an intuitive understanding of cattle behavior that impressed even Robert Hayes, who had spent decades working with livestock. She could read the mood of a herd from subtle changes in their positioning and movement patterns. And she possessed an uncanny ability to predict which animals might cause problems during routine operations. "Miss Sarah knows cattle like she was raised with them," Hayes reported to Jacob after their first day working together. "She can spot a sick animal before it shows obvious symptoms, and she understands grazing patterns better than cowboys who've been doing this work their whole lives." Maria's expertise focused on different areas, but proved equally valuable for ranch operations. Her knowledge of plant identification extended beyond basic botany to include detailed understanding of which vegetation indicated good water sources, which plants could be used for emergency medical treatment, and which areas might be suitable for expanding pasture operations. She could read weather patterns from cloud formations and wind changes with accuracy that often exceeded official forecasts. But the sisters' most impressive capability was their ability to gather information through observation and analysis. Within 3 days of their arrival, they had cataloged every person who worked on the ranch, identified the daily routines that governed ranch operations, and developed comprehensive understanding of the social and economic relationships that connected the W to the broader community. "Your foreman Robert Hayes is completely loyal to you, but he's worried about your social isolation," Sarah reported during one of their evening conversations. "He thinks you need a wife and family to give your life more purpose beyond ranch management. The ranch hands respect your fairness as an employer, but they gossip about your mysterious past and your refusal to participate in community social events," Maria added. "They're curious about why such a successful rancher lives like a hermit." Jacob realized that the sisters were conducting the same kind of intelligence-gathering operation on his household that they had undoubtedly performed throughout their lives as a survival mechanism. Their ability to read human behavior and social dynamics with such precision explained how they had navigated the complex political relationships within Comanche society and how they had successfully negotiated their transition back to Anglo communities. The first serious test of the arrangement came when Reverend William Patterson arrived unexpectedly to invite Jacob to participate in the annual Church Harvest Festival. Patterson was a well-meaning but persistently social man who had been attempting to draw Jacob back into community activities for several years. His unannounced visit created exactly the kind of situation that required careful management to protect the sisters' privacy and security. Double quotes Jacob, my friend, Patterson called out as he climbed down from his buggy. "I hope you don't mind my dropping by unannounced, but I wanted to discuss the Harvest Festival personally, rather than sending another written invitation that you might ignore." Jacob emerged from the house to greet Patterson, acutely aware that Sarah and Maria were watching the interaction from inside and evaluating his ability to handle unexpected social complications. The Reverend's timing was particularly unfortunate, as the sisters had been hanging laundry in the yard just minutes before his arrival, and their presence would be difficult to explain if Patterson noticed evidence of additional household residence. "Reverend Patterson, always a pleasure to see you," Jacob replied, positioning himself to block the Reverend's view of the clothesline where several women's garments were hanging alongside his own clothes. "What can I do for you today?" "I'm hoping you'll finally agree to participate in our community harvest celebration," Patterson said enthusiastically. "We're planning a wonderful event with food, music, and activities for families throughout the county. It would be a perfect opportunity for you to reconnect with your neighbors and perhaps meet some of the eligible young ladies who have been asking about you." Jacob managed to maintain normal conversation while remaining alert to any signs that Patterson might notice evidence of the sisters' presence. Through the kitchen window, he could see Sarah moving carefully to remove the women's clothing from the line before the Reverend might observe it during his departure. "I appreciate the invitation, Reverend, but you know I'm not much for social gatherings," Jacob replied diplomatically. The ranch keeps me pretty busy, especially during this time of year. That's exactly why you need to take time for fellowship and community connection, Patterson insisted. A man wasn't meant to live in such isolation. Jacob, God intends for us to support each other through Christian friendship and shared activities. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Patterson growing increasingly persistent about Jacob's participation in community events. Jacob found himself walking the careful line between maintaining his reputation for social reluctance and avoiding any behavior that might seem suspicious or out of character. "I'll consider attending the harvest festival," Jacob finally conceded, understanding that complete refusal might prompt Patterson to make additional unexpected visits to continue his persuasion efforts. "But I can't commit to anything more than brief appearance." After Patterson's departure, Jacob felt both relief and concern about how the sisters had evaluated his performance during the unexpected test. Managing social interactions while protecting their privacy would clearly require more sophisticated strategies than simply avoiding visitors or deflecting casual inquiries. "You handled that situation well," Sarah said when they gathered for dinner that evening. "You maintained your normal behavior patterns while protecting our presence here, and you didn't create any suspicions that might prompt additional unannounced visits." "But you also made a commitment to attend a community event," Maria pointed out. "That creates new challenges for maintaining our security while demonstrating that you can function normally in social situations despite the secrets you're now carrying." Jacob realized that protecting the sisters wouldn't simply require keeping them hidden from view. It would require him to continue participating in community life while carrying knowledge that could endanger everyone involved if improperly disclosed. The psychological pressure of maintaining such deception on a long-term basis would be substantial. The second major test came when a group of traveling cattle buyers arrived to inspect Jacob's herd and negotiate purchase agreements for his annual stock sales. The buyers were scheduled to spend 2 days on the ranch, examining animals, reviewing breeding records, and conducting the kind of detailed business discussions that often extended into evening social activities. "This creates a complex security situation," Sarah explained as they planned how to manage the buyer's visit. "We need to remain invisible while continuing our daily work, and you need to conduct normal business operations without any behavior that might suggest you're hiding something." Maria suggested a strategy that demonstrated their sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. "We'll create the impression that you've hired temporary domestic help for the busy season. If anyone notices evidence of women working in the house, they'll assume you've finally accepted the need for household assistance during important business periods." The sisters spent the day before the buyer's arrival, creating subtle evidence of their presence while ensuring that evidence appeared completely normal for a ranch household that had temporarily hired domestic workers. They arranged the kitchen to suggest regular meal preparation for multiple people, organized cleaning supplies to indicate systematic household maintenance, and positioned their personal belongings to remain accessible but unobtrusive. The 2-day visit, Sarah and Maria essentially disappeared from the visible household, while continuing to perform functions that supported Jacob's business activities. They prepared meals that appeared in the kitchen at appropriate times, maintained the house's cleanliness without being observed, and managed laundry and other domestic tasks through careful timing and strategic positioning. The cattle buyers, impressed by the sudden improvement in household organization and meal quality, commented favorably on Jacob's apparent decision to hire competent domestic help. "Smart thinking, Winchester," remarked lead buyer Harrison Clark during their final evening of negotiations. "A well-run house makes for better business discussions. These ladies you've hired certainly know their work, best meals and most comfortable accommodations I've experienced on a ranch visit." Jacob accepted the compliments while marveling at the sisters' ability to create desired impressions through subtle environmental management. They had successfully supported his business activities while remaining completely invisible to the buyers, demonstrating skills that went far beyond basic domestic work or simple hiding. The success of both tests created new confidence in the arrangement while also revealing the complexity of what long-term protection might require. Jacob was beginning to understand that supporting Thomas and Morning Star would involve not just providing physical shelter, but mastering an entirely different approach to social interaction and information management. You're adapting to security requirements faster than Iron Wolf expected, Sarah told him as they evaluated the success of the cattle buyer's visit. But you also need to understand that these tests have been relatively simple compared to what protecting Morning Star might require. A 7-year-old child creates different challenges than 2 adults who understand the need for discretion, Maria explained. Children ask questions, attract attention, and require educational and social opportunities that must be provided without exposing their true identities or circumstances. Jacob realized that his brother had been facing exactly these challenges. For 3 years, creating a life for Morning Star that provided security, education, and emotional support while maintaining the secrecy necessary for their survival. The complexity of Thomas's situation was far greater than anything Jacob had imagined. "When will I know if I've passed these preliminary tests?" Jacob asked. "When can we begin discussing actual contact with Thomas and Morning Star?" Sarah and Maria exchanged their characteristic glance of silent communication before Sarah responded. "Iron Wolf has been observing your performance through methods you haven't noticed. He's already seen enough to be encouraged about the possibility of limited contact. Tomorrow night, if you're willing, we can arrange for you to see Morning Star from a distance," Maria said quietly. "It won't be a meeting, but it will allow you to understand what you're committing to protect if reunion becomes possible." The prospect of seeing his niece, even from a distance, filled Jacob with excitement and nervousness. After 15 years of searching for his lost brother, he was about to lay eyes on family he hadn't known existed until a week ago. The moon hung like a silver coin above the Texas landscape as Jacob followed Sarah and Maria through the rugged terrain that led toward Devil's Canyon. They moved in complete silence, their footsteps muffled by years of practice in traveling without detection. Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs as they approached the moment he had been anticipating for 15 years, the first sight of his brother since that terrible day in 1872. The sisters had spent the afternoon providing detailed instructions about the evening's carefully orchestrated encounter. Every aspect had been planned to ensure maximum security while allowing for meaningful contact between the long-separated family members. Thomas had chosen a location that offered multiple escape routes if the meeting was discovered or interrupted, and he had established protocols that would protect Morning Star if anything went wrong. "Remember, you cannot call out to them or make any sudden movements," Sarah had warned during their final preparations. "Iron Wolf needs to control every aspect of this first contact to ensure Morning Star feels completely safe. She's been looking forward to seeing you, but she's also frightened," Maria had added. "Her only memories of Anglo society come from the stories her father has told her, and some of those stories include the violence that destroyed her original family." As they climbed through the rocky terrain that surrounded the canyon system, Jacob struggled to manage his emotions about the encounter ahead. The knowledge that Thomas was alive had already transformed his understanding of the past 15 years, but the prospect of actually seeing his brother and meeting the niece he had never known existed created anticipation so intense. It was almost unbearable. They reached a limestone outcropping that overlooked a natural amphitheater carved into the canyon wall by centuries of wind and water erosion. Sarah gestured for Jacob to position himself behind a screen of boulders that would conceal his presence while providing a clear view of the area below. "They'll appear in approximately 10 minutes, she whispered. "Iron Wolf has been observing." our approach from concealed positions to ensure we weren't followed or detected. Jacob settled into his hiding place and tried to prepare himself emotionally for the first glimpse of Thomas in 15 years. He had imagined this moment countless times, but all of his fantasies had involved dramatic reunions with emotional embraces and immediate restoration of their brotherhood. The reality would be far more cautious and controlled, filtered through layers of security considerations that reflected the dangerous complexity of Thomas's current circumstances. A slight movement in the shadows below caught Jacob's attention, and he watched breathlessly as two figures emerged from what had appeared to be solid rock wall. Thomas stepped into the moonlight first, and Jacob felt a shock of recognition, mixed with profound dismay at how dramatically his brother had changed during their years of separation. The Thomas Winchester who had disappeared in 1872 had been a robust young man of 18, filled with energy and optimism about building a prosperous future on the family ranch. The man Jacob now observed was leaner and harder, moving with the controlled grace of someone who had spent years surviving in hostile territory. His hair had grown long and was braided in Comanche style, and his clothing combined Anglo and Native American elements in ways that reflected his complex cultural identity. But it was Thomas's bearing that revealed the deepest changes. Gone was the easy confidence and social openness that had characterized his youth. In its place was the watchful caution of someone who had learned to evaluate every situation for potential threats and opportunities. Even in this carefully planned meeting, Thomas's eyes continuously scanned the surrounding terrain for signs of danger. Behind Thomas, a small figure emerged from the shadows with movements that mirrored her father's careful attention to security. Morning Star was exactly what Jacob would have expected from a 7-year-old daughter of Thomas Winchester and a Comanche woman, strikingly beautiful, with her father's intelligent eyes and her mother's graceful bearing. But she also carried herself with a gravity and awareness that seemed far beyond her years. Jacob watched in fascination as Thomas knelt beside his daughter and spoke to her in what appeared to be a mixture of English and Comanche. Morning Star listened intently, then nodded and looked directly toward the outcropping where Jacob was concealed. Even from a distance, he could see that she possessed the same sharp intelligence that had distinguished her father since childhood. "She knows you're watching," Maria whispered from beside him. "Iron Wolf has been preparing her for this moment for weeks, explaining who you are and why meeting you might be important for their future." Thomas rose and moved to a position where the moonlight illuminated his features clearly, apparently intending to give Jacob the opportunity to study his face and confirm his identity beyond any doubt. The gesture was both generous and heartbreaking, revealing Thomas's understanding of how much uncertainty Jacob had endured during their 15 years of separation. The face that Jacob studied in the silvery light carried the same basic features. He remembered, but 15 years of hardship had carved new lines around Thomas's eyes and mouth. More significantly, his expression carried a depth of experience and knowledge that spoke of someone who had witnessed realities that most people never encounter. This was the face of a man who had lived multiple lives, survived unimaginable losses, and found the strength to continue protecting those he loved despite overwhelming challenges. Morning Star stepped forward and looked up at her father with obvious adoration and trust. Even from a distance, Jacob could see the strong bond between them, the kind of relationship that develops between people who have depended on each other for survival during desperate circumstances. She said something to Thomas that made him smile, the first genuine expression of happiness Jacob had seen cross his brother's features. Thomas responded to his daughter's comment, then gestured toward Jacob's hiding place. Morning Star studied the rocky outcropping with intense concentration, and Jacob had the eerie sensation that she was somehow evaluating him despite being unable to see him clearly. "She's deciding whether you feel safe to her," Sarah explained quietly. "Iron Wolf has taught her to trust her instincts about people. and her opinion will influence whether he agrees to direct contact. Jacob wished desperately that he could communicate with his niece across the distance that separated them, could somehow convey his eagerness to know her and his commitment to protecting her welfare. But he understood that this first encounter was about observation rather than interaction, about allowing Morning Star to form initial impressions without the pressure of immediate social demands. Thomas lifted Morning Star onto his shoulders, and she wrapped her arms around his neck with the unconscious affection of a child who had never doubted her father's love and protection. The sight sent a pang through Jacob's heart as he realized how much family connection he had missed during his years of isolation and grief. Father and daughter remained visible for nearly 15 minutes, moving around the small clearing in what appeared to be a carefully planned display designed to give Jacob comprehensive understanding of their current circumstances. Thomas demonstrated some of Morning Star's educational progress by having her identify plants and rock formations, revealing that he had been providing her with the kind of systematic learning that would prepare her for either Anglo or tribal society. Morning Star, in turn, showed off skills that reflected her mixed cultural heritage. She moved through the terrain with the silent grace of someone raised in wilderness environments, but she also demonstrated knowledge of reading and mathematics that indicated formal educational instruction. Jacob realized that Thomas had been working to give his daughter every possible advantage for survival in an uncertain world. As the demonstration continued, Jacob began to understand that this wasn't simply an opportunity for him to observe his brother and niece. It was also a test of his emotional reactions and his ability to maintain security protocols even during highly charged personal moments. Sarah and Maria were undoubtedly monitoring his behavior as carefully as Morning Star was evaluating his hidden presence. Eventually, Thomas gestured toward Jacob's position and spoke to Morning Star in what appeared to be a formal conclusion to their evening's activities. She nodded seriously, then waved in the direction of Jacob's hiding place, a gesture so natural and innocent that it brought tears to his eyes. Father and daughter disappeared back into the shadows as silently as they had emerged, leaving Jacob with the overwhelming realization that his family was not only alive, but functioning as a loving unit despite the extraordinary challenges they faced. The loneliness that had defined his existence for 15 years suddenly seemed almost ridiculous in comparison to the isolation and responsibility that Thomas had been managing while raising his daughter in secret. "They're gone," Sarah said softly. "We should return to the ranch before anyone notices our absence." The journey back through the darkness gave Jacob time to process what he had witnessed and to understand that everything about his life was about to change fundamentally. Whether or not immediate reunion proved possible, he now knew that Thomas and Morning Star existed and needed the kind of support that only family could provide. "What happens next?" Jacob asked as they approached the ranch house. "That depends on what Morning Star tells her father about how you felt to her during tonight's observation," Maria replied. "She has the final say in whether direct contact moves forward." "But regardless of her decision about meeting you," Sarah added, "Iron Wolf has already decided that the time has come to end his complete isolation. He's been preparing to establish a more permanent and sustainable living situation that would allow Morning Star to receive proper education and social development." Jacob realized that Thomas had been planning for this transition for months, using Jacob's responses to various tests as indicators of whether family reunion could be part of his daughter's future. The careful orchestration of recent events reflected not just caution, but genuine hope that isolation might finally be replaced by family connection. "Will I know her decision soon?" Jacob asked. "Tomorrow morning," Sarah smiled. "If Morning Star approves of direct contact, Iron Wolf will come to the ranch at dawn. If she needs more time to feel comfortable with the idea, they'll arrange another observation period." As they entered the ranch house, Jacob felt the weight of 15 years of grief and uncertainty lifting from his shoulders. Whether reunion happened immediately or required additional patience, he now knew that his search for Thomas was finally over. His brother was alive, thriving despite incredible challenges, and raising a remarkable daughter who represented the future of the Winchester family. The sun was just beginning to rise over the eastern hills when Jacob spotted a lone figure walking across the pasture toward the ranch house. Even at a distance, he recognized the distinctive bearing and purposeful stride that had characterized Thomas Winchester since childhood. His brother was coming home. Jacob stepped onto the porch and waited, his heart full of gratitude for the extraordinary women who had made this reunion possible and for the remarkable child who had given them permission to be a family again. Morning Star had decided that her uncle felt safe, and that decision was about to restore everything that had been lost 15 years ago. On a dusty cattle trail in the Texas wilderness. As Thomas approached the house where they had grown up together, Jacob saw that he wasn't alone. A small figure emerged from the tall grass beside him, Morning Star, walking hand in hand with her father toward the uncle she had finally decided to trust. The Winchester family was about to be whole again, and Jacob understood that the loneliness that had defined his adult life was finally coming to an end. In exchange for $20 and a commitment to protect two remarkable sisters, he had purchased the return of his brother and gained a niece whose courage and wisdom would enrich his life beyond anything he had imagined possible. The sun climbed higher into the Texas sky, illuminating a new chapter in the Winchester family story, one that would be written by 3 generations, working together to build a future worthy of everything they had survived to reach this moment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.